Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're breaking down the U.S. Navy's absolutely staggering proposal to resurrect the battleship after, well, 8 decades. We're looking at a massive, highly controversial, and honestly deeply fascinating shift in modern naval doctrine. Let's get right into it.
$17 billion. Let's just sit with that massive number for a second. That is the shocking preliminary price tag for just one, yes, literally one of these proposed Leviathans. To put that into perspective, that's basically the entire annual defense budget of several developed nations poured entirely into a single haul.
So, you're probably wondering, why? Why on earth is the military pivoting back to a vessel class that most naval experts wrote off as a total relic of the past? For nearly a century, air power and submarines have completely ruled the oceans, making those heavily armored, gun-toting behemoths totally obsolete. So, what exactly changed?
Section 1. Return of the Battleship, from World War II to the Golden Fleet.
What's really wild to think about here is this huge 80-year void between the launch of the USS Missouri and the proposed USS Defiant. Since the mid-20th century, the whole trend has been towards smaller, stealthier, or highly specialized ships. But with this December 2025 announcement of the new BBGX class, we're seeing a timeline that leaps backward in concept, while simultaneously jumping forward in technology, aiming to hit the water by the late 2030s.
These proposed battleships are the centerpiece of what the administration is calling the Golden Fleet, but it comes with a pretty major break in tradition. Proponents argue this signals a robust return to American maritime might. Critics, on the other hand, are quick to point out that it fundamentally breaks naval naming conventions that have been strictly in place since 1862. By naming the class after a sitting president rather than a U.S. state, well, it immediately became a flashpoint of intense debate before the blueprints were even finalized.
Moving on to Section 2. Anatomy of the Leviathan. 35,000 tons of firepower.
Okay, the crucial takeaway here is that this new ship is effectively triple the size of the Navy's current workhorse destroyer. When you compare the 35,000-ton displacement of the Trump class to the roughly 9,700-ton Arleigh Burke, the upscaling is just staggering. We're talking about the footprint of a full-on amphibious assault ship, but dedicated purely to delivering devastating weapons payloads.
And to fill up that massive frame, engineers intend to literally pack it with hypersonic missiles, a restored nuclear cruise missile capability, and directed energy laser weapons. It's essentially every single piece of cutting-edge tech in the U.S. arsenal consolidated onto one deck. It's no longer about thick armor and massive artillery shells, it's about networked, long-range, high-tech devastation. And speaking of high-tech, the absolute crown jewel of its secondary battery is this sci-fi-sounding 32-megajoule railgun. Instead of explosive ammo, it uses pure, devastating kinetic energy. It uses massive electrical pulses to accelerate a solid projectile up to Mach 6 or beyond, over 100 nautical miles away. On paper, it's a lot safer since you aren't storing tons of explosive powder on board. And it's practically impossible for an enemy to intercept.
Which brings us to Section 3, the price of power, a historic price tag.
But putting lasers, railguns, and hypersonic missiles on a single hull brings us right back to that eye-watering $17 billion figure. And this highlights a really jarring reality. This surface combatant is actually going to cost more than the Navy's absolute most advanced nuclear aircraft carriers. The Ford-class carrier represents the historical pinnacle of naval spending, yet this new battleship eclipses even that. It completely shifts the paradigm from projecting power via an embarked air wing to projecting power directly from the ship's own onboard energy systems.
Now, the Navy defends this cost by pointing out that traditional carriers and these new battleships serve entirely distinct, yet incredibly necessary strategic roles. As the source material highlights, you need unimaginable amounts of electrical power for those directed energy lasers and railguns. So this ship is basically designed from the ground up as a floating, highly weaponized power plant.
Section 4, strategy behind the ship, the arsenal ship concept.
To impartially understand the Navy's perspective, we really have to look at the severe limitations of current fleet firepower. For example, during the early 2026 conflict with Iran, U.S. forces rapidly burned through 850 Tomahawk missiles in just 4 weeks. That is an astonishing expenditure rate against a regional power, and it exposed a critical vulnerability in how the current fleet sustains long-term engagements.
So the strategic rationale here is to build a massive, sustained presence, a ship that can stay in the fight without having to constantly retreat for resupply. See, current destroyers and cruisers just can't reload their vertical launch tubes at sea. Once they fire their 90 or so missiles, they're basically out of the fight and have to head back to a secure port. The Battleship concept intends to solve this by bringing a massive, high-capacity magazine right into the contested zone, while also acting as a central command node for AI and drone swarms.
But it's not all smooth sailing. Let's look at Section 5, the tactical controversies, paper specs versus real-world logistics. When you actually crunch the numbers, the design presents a pretty glaring mathematical inefficiency. You're building a 35,000-ton ship to field 128 vertical launch missiles. That's 273 tons of ship per missile, compared to just 80 tons per missile on legacy cruisers. Critics strongly argue this is an incredibly inefficient design, mostly caused by trying to cram way too many competing experimental weapons onto a single deck.
Furthermore, critics are quick to point out that this highly touted railgun is far from fully operational. I mean, the barrels are literally melting down after firing too many full-power shots. Firing a projectile at Mach 6 creates extreme heat and friction. Without massive cooling intervals, the weapon destroys itself, which makes its practical, sustained rate of fire in a real combat scenario highly questionable.
Then there's the power issue. Relying on conventional fossil fuels is another massive controversy here. Tying a hugely power-hungry energy weapon to a vulnerable fuel supply line creates a real strategic liability. I mean, why build a ship that needs millions of amps of electricity for lasers and not make it self-sustaining with nuclear reactors like the Ford-class? If an enemy takes out the slow-moving oiler ship assigned to refuel it, this $17 billion asset just becomes a sitting duck. Ultimately, naval analysts are warning against putting all our eggs in one massive basket. Modern naval doctrine is all about decentralized fleets, spreading out your weapons across many smaller ships so one lucky enemy strike doesn't wipe out your entire combat capability. By consolidating all this power into one giant target, the Navy really risks losing funding for the much-needed, much cheaper next-generation destroyers. So as this debate rages on between overwhelming firepower and logistical reality, we have to ask ourselves a final, pivotal question. Is the Golden Fleet the ultimate future of naval dominance, or is it just a $17 billion floating target? It's a high-stakes gamble on the future of warfare, and the answer will undoubtedly shape global security for decades to come. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me, and we'll catch you in the next one.